Hi, my name is Nelson Lee. I'm the pastor of Agape Home Fellowship. Thanks for taking the time to join me as we continue our study in 1 Peter. Today we're in chapter 5. And remember, this study is entitled Preparing Your Mind for Action. And what we're going to talk about today is serving God willingly. And we're going to look at the first 7 verses of chapter 5. Peter starts off here addressing church leaders. So here's what he says. Therefore, I strongly urge the elders among you, and that is the pastors, the spiritual leaders of the church. I strongly urge the elders among you as a fellow elder. So we see that Peter here is an elder. And as an eyewitness, Peter is an eyewitness. He has been called to testify to the sufferings of Christ. In other words, he was there. Remember, Peter was one of the ones that was there. He actually witnessed it, as well as one who shares in the glory that is also to be revealed. Peter is first telling us here that there's a hierarchy in the church, that we have elders, we have pastors, there's spiritual leaders, and he is imploring us to share in the glory that is to be revealed. There is a lot of glory to be revealed when Jesus comes again. And even though we work very hard now, even though it may get old, it may get tired, you may get ill from it even. We see a couple of instances of that in the scripture where people were sick unto the point of death because they worked so hard. But Peter's imploring the elders to continue on and to shepherd and guide, verse 2, to shepherd and guide and protect the flock of God among you. We, as leaders, we have many challenges, and we have many things that we are commanded to do by the Lord God. One of the things we're commanded to do here is shepherd. And the idea here is to see after the needs of the sheep. We are to literally feed the flock, to take care of their spiritual needs and in some cases their physical needs, and to guide and protect. If you're a pastor, if you're a church leader, it is understood that you're going to have more spiritual wisdom, perhaps, than many people in your congregation. And that's by design. That is because God has specifically and specially gifted you to know how to guide and take oversight of the flock, to know the needs of the flock. You know, the shepherds knew the needs of their flock. They knew when they needed to eat. They knew when they needed to be led to water. They knew when they needed to rest. And they knew when they needed to move. They knew when winter was coming. And so they could take them out of the open fields and they could put them in confined spaces in pens to keep them warm. And they knew when the grass was sprouting so that they could get them out of those pens and get them out into the field so that they could eat. A shepherd, an elder, a pastor, an overseer is called to do a lot of things. And we have to do it with diligence. We have to do it with our eyes on the prize. And Peter says here, don't do it under compulsion. In other words, don't feel like it's a chore. And if you're in Christian leadership, the second that you feel like working for your congregation becomes a chore, then there's a big problem. Because we are not to be that way. But the very fact that Peter includes it here means that it can happen. It was happening in the days of Peter, and it happens today. And we call that pastor burnout. And I will just simply say that pastors do get burned out. They get tired. But the main reason why they get tired and burned out is because they get their eyes off the prize and they start looking at themselves and their family. And it is tough to juggle the responsibilities of ministry and family. But we must remember priorities. And as a pastor, many times God's church comes first. Because serving God sometimes will put out the family. And that is a reason why if you're in leadership, your spouse, your wife, has to completely understand and be absolutely on board with you pastoring. Because if there's any doubts, any reservations, it's going to show up in these times of trial. And so we have to do it voluntarily according to the will of God and not motivated for shameful gain. You know, Paul addresses this, and it's in the, let me turn real quick to the book of Philippians. And we're going to look at chapter 1. The book of Philippians, chapter 1. Some, it is true, this is verse 15, some, it is true, are preaching Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill and of a loyal spirit. The latter preach Christ out of love, because they know that I have been put here, Paul was in prison, for the defense of the gospel. But the former preach Christ out of insincerity, out of selfish ambition, thinking they are causing me distress in my imprisonment. Paul says this about those guys. What then does it matter? So as long as in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, I will rejoice. Now, what does that have to do with being a good shepherd and not doing it out of shameful gain? Well, what was happening while Paul was in prison? This was his first imprisonment in Rome. Paul had a good following, and just like many people who are in the ministry, a good following sometimes means a good offering. It means that people take care of your needs, and out of love. You know, they want to see the ministry thrive. They want to see the gospel preached. They want to see the kingdom expand, and so they give money for that purpose. Well, when Paul became imprisoned, there was a group of preachers, of pastors, who seized on the void that Paul left. Now Paul is no longer there. Paul is in prison. And so what they did was they said, well, Paul's in prison. Maybe I can stand in his place and I will get the money. See, they weren't doing it out of love. They were doing it out of selfish gain. They were taking advantage of the fact that Paul was no longer there, and out of sight, out of mind, people were like, well, I can't give money to Paul. Why would I give money to Paul? He's in prison. So I'll give money to this guy. Well, some of the men were there out of love. They truly wanted the gospel to be preached. And they accepted that money, and they used that money to further the kingdom. But there were a group of men, and I don't know how many there were, but apparently it was more than one, who said, you know what, I'm going to take advantage of this. And they drew a salary, so to speak, so that they could pay for the nice things that they have. And that is never to be our way. We are never to want to take money from our congregation so that we can have nice things. That is preaching out of a wrong, motivated heart. We should have, Peter says here, we should be preaching and teaching and caring for the flock with wholehearted enthusiasm. We should be enthusiastic about the fact that we get to care for the flock of God. Not lording it over those, verse 3, assigned to your care. Do you realize that the people in your church are assigned to your care? The people in Agape Home Fellowship have been assigned to my care by God. That is an immense responsibility to know that they have been assigned to me. And you know, they have responsibility too. And I want to talk about that for a second. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, it says this, obey your spiritual leaders and submit to them. In other words, you recognize their authority. For they are keeping watch over your souls and continually guarding your spiritual welfare as those who will give an account of their stewardship for you. Let them do this with joy and not with grief and groans, for this would be of no benefit to you. So what the writer of Hebrews is saying is that there's a couple of responsibilities here. Okay, there's two parties. The party of the pastor, that group of people has a responsibility to watch over their soul and guard their spiritual welfare. As a pastor, that is my job, to watch over the spiritual growth of my flock, to look at them and to examine them and see where I can help them grow spiritually. but to also guard them spiritually. And I can do that through prayer and also through interaction. If I see them getting into something that I know is going to cause them harm or cause their family harm that is sinful, then I can interject my feelings, my desires on the matter. The other party, the receiver, the church member, has a responsibility as well to understand that I've been put in a position, and if you're a church leader, you have been put in a position of authority, and that we will give an account. And if you don't feel for some reason that I'm doing what is right, you need to just understand that I've got to give an account to that. You don't have to give an account. I do. And the responsibility of the church member goes further than this. That you have to do this with joy. That you have to submit so that I will have joy and I will not be grieved and have groans. Because see, if you are living a life that causes me frustration and causes me have to pay special attention to you because you're not doing things right, and over and over and over and over and over again, I have to talk to you about it, then you are causing me grief, you're causing me to have groanings, and you will reap no benefit from that. And so that's not good. But as pastors, we have to remember not to lord it over our flock. In other words, if I'm helping a member get through a difficult time, or maybe they're struggling in a certain area, I have to do it with gentleness and love, and sometimes love gets passionate. But I can never do what my dad used to do, which is do as I say, not as I do, or just simply say, do it because I said so. That is lording over it. That is me being the Lord instead of Jesus Christ. But be examples. See, as church leaders, we're to be examples to the flock. We're to be examples of what a Christian man or a Christian woman looks like. Verse 4 says, and when the chief shepherd, remember, we're shepherds. We shepherd a flock. But there is a chief shepherd, and his name is Jesus Christ. And he is shepherd of the shepherd. He shepherds flocks all over this world from 2,000 years ago to this day and on in the future. He's the chief shepherd. When he appears, we will receive an unfading crown of glory. Did you know that there's a crown, and it's called the glory crown, for those who do set the example and are proper examples and shepherd and guide and protect the flock of God? There's a reward for that. And we have to strive for that reward. Peter shifts gears here. He now gets out of church leadership in verse 5, and he starts talking to the young men, just other men in the congregation, maybe who aren't, they are of lesser rank and experience, perhaps. Okay, perhaps they're new Christians. He says, likewise, you younger men, be subject to your elders. Now, there's a subtle shift here in what Peter is saying. He goes from the first 4 verses about talking about the office of an elder to those who are just older. Remember, an elder is someone who is older and wiser in the faith. But we have elders. And you know, my dad taught me to respect my elders. He would say that to me over and over again. Respect your elders. If I'm in a store and I'm conversing with a man or a lady who is older than me, I'm very respectful to them. I say yes, sir, and no, sir, and yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, because that is our custom here in the United States. Likewise, you younger men, be subject to your elders. In other words, seek their counsel. Young men, if you've got a problem, chances are that the men that are older than you have gone through this problem sometime in their life. If you're having a problem dealing with your wife or with your children, you know what? I would imagine that the older men in your congregation who are godly have had some of the same issues that you're having now. So perhaps maybe not, instead of complaining about it, and maybe alongside of just seeking God's counsel, why don't you seek the counsel of godly men? Seek the counsel of people who have experience. If I have an issue with my car, I'm not very mechanically inclined. I can do a lot of things, but working on cars is not one of them. And so I have to get experience to help me because I have no experience in it. And there are some things that I've had to do around here. We recently just did a remodel and built an entire room. I had experience doing sheetrock and taping and texturing and painting and doing all of these things and creating the studs for the sheetrock to go on. I have experience doing that. I was able to do that without much guidance. But I had no experience doing the electrical. I had to look for somebody who had more experience than I to help me out with that. And so likewise, men, you need to seek the counsel of older men. Older, godly men. Now, don't just seek the counsel of some old man because he's older than you, who does not walk with the Lord, because he is more apt to give you ungodly advice than godly advice. You want to seek the people that you trust to give you the Word of God, to give you God's idea on the subject. Seek their counsel. And all of you, in other words, now he's talking about pastors, young men, old men, elders in leadership, and just plain old men in the church. All of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. For God is opposed to the proud. He gives grace to the humble. That is Proverbs 3:34. You know, Jesus himself talked a lot about humility. Jesus himself demonstrated humility when he washed the feet of the disciples. You realize that was the servant's job at a meal, to wash the feet of the guests? But yet Jesus did it. Jesus demonstrated what it was, what he wants us to do as far as being leaders, especially to be leaders as servants. Servant leadership is what it's called. Verse 6 says, therefore humble yourselves. You know, one of the problems in the church today is many people are seeking their own way. They're seeking admiration. They're seeking accolades. They're seeking to be made the focal point. Even the apostles, James and John, they had an argument about who was going to be first. And Jesus simply said, he who will be first is the one who's last, and the last shall be first. In other words, we need to treat everybody else as if they're more important than us. And that is so hard to do. It is so hard to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God. And that means to set aside our self-pride, to set aside the pride that wants to make us first, the pride that wants us to rule the roost. We need to set that aside so that he can exalt us at the appropriate time. Do you know that there's reward coming? And there is a time when Jesus is going to reward you and exalt you. That admiration and those accolades and that notoriety that you've been looking for, that you've been striving for, it's coming. It's coming one day. One day, Jesus Christ, when he gives reward, will let everybody know exactly what you did and what it cost you. Be patient in the meantime. Don't seek the reward too soon. Let God reward you. And above all, verse 7, casting all your cares, your anxieties, all your worries, and all your concerns once and for all on him, for he cares for you. You know, that Greek word there, casting all our cares, our anxieties, that Greek word for casting means to literally throw it. And the idea here is you're throwing a blanket on the back of a horse or a donkey. You're throwing that load on the back of that animal. And Jesus himself said, take my yoke because it's light. My burden is light. Because the reason why it's light is because he is carrying our burden. He carried our burden on the cross. That is the reason why we can cast all our concerns. We spend a lot of time living anxiously, especially during times of persecution. Times of persecution is really when you're going to notice anxiety. You're going to notice anxiety not only for yourself. You're going to notice anxiety more for the people you love. You're going to notice the anxiety, I would say, most of all for your children. If bad things were to happen in this country now and we were to be persecuted for our faith, my chief anxiety would be with my kids. I would be anxious for my wife. I would be anxious for myself, but for my children. But even that, I have to cast upon the frame of Jesus Christ, knowing that He cares for me, knowing that He is watching over me with deep affection, and He's careful. He knows exactly what is happening in my life and what I'm going through. And if I can get it in my mind, if I can prepare my mind to understand that I'm going to be persecuted, and I can prepare my mind to understand that God the Father and His Son Jesus Christ is watching and caring for me, then I should have no problem casting my anxiety and my worries on Him. Next time we'll conclude this session on 1 Peter. We will conclude this study on how to prepare our mind for action by looking at who our opponent is. We're going to look at verse 8, and we're going to talk about the devil. So until then, may God richly bless you, my beloved.